Okay, my name's Mary Carskadon. I started doing sleep in 1970, in the autumn of 1970, early autumn of 1970. It was an interesting start. I was recruited by Dr. Dement to come to Stanford. I had been in Pennsylvania where I did college, and I got to California. Well, I got to California and Stanford. I was driven there by some of my college friends. The dean of the college had loaned us his station wagon to drive across country. And I always thought that was, I don't know if that was just they wanted to get rid of me that badly, or he was a very kind and generous individual. So I landed in California and in the Stanford group. Before it was a sleep disorder center, so it's primarily research center. And well, things morphed across the years. Almost as soon as I got there, well, I started learning, and I'm one of the lucky few who learned at the foot of the master. You know, Dr. Dement, I remember him sitting down with sleep records and teaching me how to identify the stages. It was Bill Dement teaching me. I didn't, to me, it was Bill Dement, the husband of my cousin, Pat Dement. So I had known him for a while, and he's a relative, but soon he's a master in the field. Indeed, I think right before then there had been a Life magazine cover story about him and a big story in the New Yorker, and so it was clear this wasn't just Bill. This was a really accomplished scientist. One of the things, he talked about early on when he was recruited to Stanford, the medical school was in San Francisco, and he started looking for patients with narcolepsy. So narcolepsy was really a first interest of his, and then the medical school moved down the peninsula to Palo Alto. But one of the early papers that he did with Al Rechtschaffen was looking at the nocturnal sleep of narcoleptics. Wasn't one of his early papers, but one of the early narcolepsy papers. And they were the first to describe and understand that the REM sleep onset was a critical feature of narcolepsy, and unusual and atypical. And for a while, the thought was it's pathognomic of narcolepsy, the illness. And so, there was that. Bill was also interested in insomnia and was doing some trials with pharmaceutical companies, but also interested in his patients who would come in with huge amounts of, barbiturates and other things going on to help treat their insomnia. At any rate, when I went there, sometime that first year, 1970, he started a clinic. And I had been out of college for 1 year. I had no training in this area. I had nothing. And I didn't know what a clinic was or how to set it, but I helped set up, the forms and the procedures. And what did I know? Luckily, another person named Vicki Varner was there. She was a little further along than I, but we were sort of playing it by ear. And we got it organized, and that was good. When I arrived in California, I bought a car very inexpensively from Christian Guilleminault. It was a little Volkswagen, because he had gone back to France for a couple of years more training. And so I sort of lucked into getting a cute little VW. At any rate, so Christian wasn't there anymore, and we were trying to get this clinic up and going, and it had a couple of bedrooms, and people were interested in the nighttime sleep. But Bill's there, but I need to know how to understand and quantify the daytime symptoms as well. So for him, right away, it wasn't just what's happening at night and what's going wrong at night, but what's going wrong in the daytime and how can we understand it. And that, I think, comes as well from his work and his interest in narcolepsy. How do I know when we've effectively treated the hypersomnolence that they experience in the daytime? So, one of the folks who worked there at the time was a graduate student named Eric Hoddes. He was a psychology grad student, and he figured out, he did a wonderful set of work to put together the Stanford Sleepiness Scale. And, people can read about this in those early papers. Hoddes, Hoddes, Eric. But he used a technique, a psychological, technique to create a scale that is actually an equal interval scale. So I don't think people know that the Stanford Sleepiness Scale, that 7-point scale, was developed with equally appearing intervals, at least statistically, between those 7 numbers, which I think, if you think about it, people haven't really used it that way or have thought of it in that way. At any rate, I remember very well, Eric went to, Roget's Thesaurus and wherever else he could find synonyms for various levels of alertness and sleepiness. And he put them on cards. And I think we had like 100 or more of those, and then recruited people to sort the cards into 7 piles. And with that information, he used, I think it's called Thorndike's method of equally appearing intervals to make the scale. So if you're familiar with the scale, you'll see it's various words or phrases for each of the 7 scale points. So that was, that was news that was greatly important to quantifying the feelings or the experience of the patients in terms of their daytime sleepiness. So we could get that at baseline or at the first visit, and then we could get it after they've slept in the lab, and then after treatment, we could also assess it. So that was very useful. And around that time, this was kind of early on, I quit. No, I was in California, all my friends were in Pennsylvania, and I was a research tech. So I was a research assistant for a number of years there. And so Bill, of course, said, no, don't go. We'll think of something. And so he had me start working up data and helping to write papers. And Dr. Gilmino had me help write his paper, or edit his papers. Obviously, his English wasn't, he's French. And he would, I don't know if anyone has told you all this, but he would write the draft of his paper in longhand on basically tissue paper. And so and with the European style of writing. So I'm there trying to make sense of this and to make it into a publishable article. So I got very skilled at reading his franglais and looking through the tissue paper to try and find what he was saying. So that was fun, and that was a good challenge for me as well. And I know CG really appreciated that kind of help. So I think the first paper on my CV is Gilmino and Carskadon, something. So then Bill challenged me, well, let's find something else for you to look at. And so we had been tracking patients with insomnia and their complaints and their perception of their sleep, and then recording them in the lab. And so I looked at those data, comparing their sleep diaries and their questionnaires and the PhD data. So that was a pretty good study that I did. But back to the clinic, we were still kind of struggling with the symptom of sleepiness and how to characterize it, because you would see patients who would get some, in those days it was mostly amphetamine to treat the sleepiness. And they would report much improvement on the Stanford Sleepiness Scale. No longer were they a 7, they were a 2 or a 3. And yet, they'd come into their appointments, and sit there and fall dead asleep. And for you and I, and that's not a 2 or 3, that's a 7. And so that was one of the challenges of really interpreting that sleepiness report. So one of the other things Dr. Dement was interested in was the REM, non-REM sleep cycle. And he had a hypothesis that if we were awake, substituted awake for REM, we wouldn't need REM sleep anymore. And so he had some undergrads start doing what he called a 90-minute day. So subjects would be awake for 30 minutes and sleep for 90 minutes, or be awake for 60 minutes, sleep for 30 minutes, again and again and again, 16 times around each 24 hours. And his hypothesis was they wouldn't have REM sleep in any of those 30-minute little naps, 16 naps. I mean, it was 8 hours every 24 hours they were sleeping, and he thought they wouldn't have REM sleep. Well, we took that, we did a few more studies with that approach beyond what the undergraduate students has done. And indeed, we did find that not only did they have slow wave and non-REM sleep in these naps, they would also have REM sleep. And so, and across, we did, one of the runs was 6 regular 24-hour days. So we had 96 90-minute days that we could look at. And we saw variability that was predictable in the sleep latency. So, and they were having REM sleep within those 30-minute naps. So, maybe this would be a way to measure both sleepiness and the appearance of REM sleep early on during sleep as a way specifically to look at people with narcolepsy and see if we could diagnose this. At the time, the lab test was a longer nap. And this was mostly Friedrich Roth, who was in an Eastern European country. And he was using this and crafting several parameters from the single daytime nap that he used to characterize an individual as having narcolepsy or not. And one of the things, at least what I saw when I read his work, was that he would have a lot of false negatives. So the patients who had a clear, set of symptoms that would make you think they have narcolepsy wouldn't manifest the REM sleep onset in that single nap. And so, working with Bill, we thought, well, let's give them more than one nap. Let's do the multiple sleep latency test. And so that was really the origin of that. And the first run we did with that was in college students, just to see, is this really going to work? Or can we set up parameters that will be useful? And without much, without deep thought, I guess, I decided let's do it every 2 hours, because we don't want to get into the, infradian cycle of 90 minutes. So we'll do it every 2 hours, and let's just stop after 20 minutes, because we don't want people lie there getting bored if they're not falling asleep. And, and let's separate them by 2 hours and just keep doing it. And we did it in the college students. We only had 6 kids to start. And we also sleep deprived them for a night to see, will it pick up sleepiness? Well, nobody, I was worried, maybe they won't fall asleep in 20 minutes. Well, one nap of 6 participants across, I don't know how many SLTs we did that person not fall asleep? And we had them sleeping what they thought was their usual amount of sleep that they needed, which really wasn't the case. But at any rate, the protocol worked. And so, we subsequently applied it in many other ways with kids and older people and, sleep deprivation and so on and so forth. But also then they took it to the clinic to use in patients with narcolepsy. And I believe it was a 1978 paper showed a clear split between the patients with narcolepsy and healthy adults. The patients with narcolepsy were in what Dr. Dement called the twilight zone. So just running along at 5 minutes or less sleep latency. And they were having REM sleep onsets. And the healthy normals were, up around, on average, about 12 to 13 minutes across the day. So that was really, I think, an important step in recognizing clinical utility for the SLT once we put it into narcolepsy. Now, during that time, we had the summer sleep camp, which was in a dormitory on the Stanford campus. And Gilmano came back from Europe and he said, there's this other thing going on where people stop breathing when they're asleep, and really brought sleep apnea back to the clinic. And one of the interesting things that was very frustrating, I think, for Christian and for all of us, was he took this new disorder and tried to get the pulmonary division at Stanford Hospital interested in working with him and working with these patients. And the chief of pulmonary medicine said, no, there's no such thing. This does not exist. You're full of it. I mean, he knew about Pickwick, which is a little different, but this thing, no. And actually, I just told this story the other day to one of my colleagues at Brown, who's in pulmonary medicine, and I couldn't remember the guy's name. And she said, oh, was that Eugene Robinson? So apparently he was notorious, I guess. But at any rate, the Europeans they already had some pretty good clinical sleep programs going on, even before the 1970 when we started at Stanford. And, Christian was always right there. It was so great at meetings. Someone would get up and give a talk, and we saw these patients and we evaluated them with this disorder. And CG would stand up and say, I have seen 7 patients with these. I mean, he always was there at the forefront. It was so, he's so curious and so ready to go out and look for the next thing. It was really, a wonderful part of being part of that. I mean, I wasn't in the clinic. I was out of the clinic pretty darn fast because I wasn't trained to be there. But I was a tech in the clinic, stayed up all night. And I remember, we were doing stuff no one had really done before. And Bill was always so fascinated in CG. And it was, the one, I remember vividly, one of the patients, this tiny woman, a little overweight, who was on, bushels full of hypnotic medications. And so Bill was, very interested at the time. And I think everyone was, how do you wean people off these high doses of very hazardous medication? I mean, barbiturates are not very safe, and that was what was the toolkit, or Cinequan, or, which I don't remember what the name of that is, but it wasn't a very safe medicine. But at any rate, this woman, so we hooked her up, and she said, yeah, my legs move a lot at night. And, RLS then was this extremely rare disorder. That's how it was described. And as we know now, once you start looking for stuff, you're going to find it. But this woman, it was amazing. So we were still using polygraphs, ink writing polygraphs, and the amount of ink she used with all of that movement was just off the charts, so to speak. How to handle that kind of illness and yet, with avoiding the rebound from the withdrawals. And it was a really intriguing situation. So, and we would see, new things all the time. Although, as I say, I wasn't in the clinic, and staying up all night, it loses its charms, I guess, pretty soon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about, the beginnings of the field, the clinical field. So Dr. Dement taught a course at Stanford for many years, and I was a teaching assistant, and I would help write the exams. Well, I ended up writing the exams. But the other thing that happened in our summer program, the sleep camp, we started doing training programs for technologists and in clinicians who wanted to, there was, no one knew what or how or when. And then Sharon Keenan joined with this training effort, and I wrote test questions based on that and based on Dr. DeMent's class. And the very first PSG polysomnography test that was done for the clinicians, I wrote. And I graded. But it's, that's part of the history, I think, that's lost to the ages. But for the first 3 or 4 years of that, and then, as the field got organized and, the issue of certification and so forth became more one of let's make ourselves legit so that we can become a board certified specialty. Real people started making, when I say real people, the real doctors who knew the clinical medicine. But in terms of the sort of more technical side of things, I was really, and even the basics of sleep, and then we were also training the techs as well and working on the testing of them. And Sharon Keenan was really critical for that. So So I kind of got involved with the sleep disorders medicine thing through sort of helping, raise the floor, I guess, a little bit through those efforts. And so I don't know, I can't remember exactly why they put me on the board. I remember it was hard for me because it wasn't always, so I'm a non-clinician. And so it was hard for me to understand the clinical perspective. And I felt like I was always on the other side of the fence from the proposals and propositions that were coming up. And so I didn't sustain my efforts there because it just felt I didn't have the perspective to really be a useful contributor to the effort. And I think that the Academy was better off without me in that regard. It's and one of the other things that I'd like to mention, and I remember sleep apnea. Before I go there, I have another anecdote I'd like to share. So we had the summer sleep camp. It was in a dormitory at Stanford. At the time, it was called Lambda Nu. It was a fraternity housing place. And every summer for 10 years, we would move in, cover the windows, darken the windows, put in air conditioners, lay cable all the way down to this little cul-de-sac with 4 bedrooms around a little tiny lounge and a toilet. And we would do all kinds of sleep studies. That's where we did the kids' studies, all of those. And we did some clinical studies. And so Dr. DeMent came to me and said, look, we have this patient who has, we think, pretty bad sleep apnea, and I want to do MSLT on this person. And I said, okay, you realize, Dr. DeMent, this is not a hospital. We do not have doctors or crash carts or any of that here. I have undergraduate students that I've trained as the technical staff. And he said, yeah, okay. Let's run this patient. So we ran him on a night, and it was really my first time I'd seen someone with obstructive sleep apnea. So this gentleman, he was so impaired. I'm a pretty good conversationalist, and I just remember we were talking in the hallway of this dorm, and I'm going to call him Mr. Smith. So I'm there, I don't know, telling about what we're doing and so forth. And Mr. Smith leans against the wall and starts falling asleep. I'm there, this guy is really sick. Bill, do you really want us to be studying him? So we hooked him up for the night, and we had, our technology. It was so much fun. most of the people in the academy don't know this, but we had our oxygen saturation was on this big thing that attached to the ear. And I remember building thermistors out of, the thermistor, and then you'd solder the wires on and you put it in a bridge, and building strain gauges out of elastic and mercury. So they were mercury-filled strain gauges, and that's why I'm a little crazy now from working with the mercury. But anyway, we were building these things. And we didn't have cameras in the rooms. Remember, we just set up in a dormitory. One of the technologists or technical guys had set up a bell system for the rooms that was basically, it was this band, and it had a number would flash when the person pushed a switch in their room. It was based on car signaling technology. Anyway, so I stayed in this dorm all the time. I slept there. I lived there during the summers. And, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, after we had set up this patient, who, by the way, you could hear him snoring, the other end of campus practically. But a knock on my door, Mary, something really terrible has happened. You've got to come down. That was the student we henceforth called Poor George, because he had to come wake me up in the middle of the night. So I go down to the tech area, and the record is just all nothing anymore except artifact. And I said, George, what happened? And, well, the bell rang, and then everything went crazy, and it wasn't this bad, but so we went down to the room where this patient was sleeping and knocked on the door, Mr. Smith, and nothing. Said, okay, George, let's just go in. And it was a struggle to get in because Mr. Smith was on the floor beside the bed. So he'd apparently rung the bell for a bathroom trip, fallen out of bed, torn off his hookup, and was sound asleep again. So we got him up, took all the wires off, we're cleaning him up, took him to the toilet, and we're all ready to redo the hookup. And I'm there, George, why don't you go into the restroom and see what's happening? And Mr. Smith was sitting on the toilet, sound asleep. So we brought him back. We finished, rehooking him up. And he slept the rest of the night uneventfully, although he was having apneas, which we could see even with our crude, 1970s equipment. And the next morning, we put him in for his first nap. And by then, I'm pretty distressed at how ill this person was and how unequipped we were for that. And so I called Dr. DeMent. Bill, you've got to come over. I can't do this without having somebody who knows medicine here. And so Bill comes over, and they're, Bill, he needs something that's not us. He said, well, let's see what his MSLTs look like. So the guy fell asleep instantaneously, and Bill snuck into the bedroom, and he came out, and he was white as a sheet, I'll say, but he said, oh my God, his lips are blue, his nails are blue. This is not a good sign. I mean, he hadn't seen a patient like this before either. Probably Christian had, but Bill certainly hadn't. And he realized, well, yeah, it was probably a mistake to try and study him So he, we got him up, got him dressed, and he went straight to the hospital. Very shortly thereafter, had a tracheostomy. And he was cured, basically. I mean, that was amazing. These patients, would then describe their lives as just being totally different. One of the tales Bill would tell about a patient who's an Oakland Raiders fan, and he would go to the games and fall asleep in the stadium, and how happy he was after he had his tracheostomy and could go to the games and stay awake for the whole game. So we've come a long way. I mean, we really have, and I don't think that there are as many patients that sick anymore. And I hope if there are and they get into the clinic, they get in before that 6 or 8 month wait and get the newer treatments, because it's just, that just boggled my mind how sick that gentleman was and how his life must have just been, without any satisfaction at all. Well, I think one of the most satisfying things for Bill and for me was the commission. So, and that was the commission for sleep disorders medicine. And that was early on, reasonably early on. I think it was in maybe the early 80s. And Bill just knew that for sleep medicine to thrive, for patients to be helped, for us to do the kinds of outreach we needed to do, and we still need to do, to let people know about sleep illness and sleep health, he decided that what we needed as a field, in his mind, it was the National Institute for Sleep Disorders Medicine. So he knew some people in Congress. I think his local congressman helped get a, congressionally mandated commission for sleep disorders medicine. Of course, it had no funding, so Bill had to fundraise for it and get people to help. But I was, privileged to be asked to be on the commission. And it was really fascinating. And Bill's approach was for us to go to different cities around the nation where there was someone doing sleep medicine and where there were patients who would come and testify to the commission about their perceptions of what was needed and how they were suffering and how, things weren't going well, and that there really needed to be a national resource for this. And ultimately, a center we didn't get the institute, but we did get what's been a very effective center that NHLBI became the home of. One of the things, it's so interesting to me when I think back about some of the things I would hear the sleep docs saying was, oh my God, if the pulmonary people come into the field, we'll be overrun by these people who are just trying to make a buck. And because they were mostly in psychiatry, they really wanted the center in NIMH, but it was the best thing for sleep medicine, not just because sleep apnea is so, prevalent and such a huge medical problem, but also because of the science and the clinical research that the pulmonary people had done, that we've learned so much more. And it's just, it's the rising tide phenomenon, not the overwhelming tidal flood phenomenon. So I think, those suspicions or fears, and I think of that when I think of other kinds of disorders and approaches that people are coming up with. Well, yeah, it's gonna help us. It's not gonna, defeat the purpose, because it's a huge area of need. And we need as many brains and as many approaches as we can find to help, mitigate all the issues that there are. So I think that's, thank you, pulmonary people, for coming into the field. It's made a huge difference.